All right, we should begin, I think. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to have a full house today. And it's a lovely day because it's Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day, but also because we have a distinguished speaker join us today. We have Professor Michael Barnett with us. Professor Michael Barnett is University Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University. Previously, he taught at the University of Minnesota, where we met, and at the University of Wisconsin. And Professor Barnett is one of the world's foremost IO theorists and an expert on international organization, global governance, humanitarianism, and religion and world politics. He's the author of many influential books, including Empire of Humanity, A History of Humanitarianism, Rules for the World, International Organizations and World Politics, co-authored with Marty Fenimore, and winner of many awards, and Power in Global Governance. His latest book, I'll give a pitch, is The Star and the Stripes, A History of Foreign Policies of Americans. He's the author of many influential articles as well in journals such as International Organization, World Politics, and the European Journal of International Relations, and he was until recently the associate editor of International Organization. I can also proudly say that he's a mentor and a friend of mine. Michael will speak to us today about a topic that should be of interest to us all, that is the future of global governance. And this is a topic that seems to be on the news constantly these days, yet for all the wrong reasons. So thank you, Michael, for being here. The format is, Michael will have about 45 minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for about 45 minutes as well. So please, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanni. I was here about 6 years ago, and it was wonderful, and I'm just thrilled to be back. So thank you for inviting me. And I first want to thank Giovanni, Dr. Mantilla, for inviting me to come. So when he asked me, I always said, of course, I get my clicker. Yay. And I also was told that I'm competing with Mother's Day. Not that I can compete, but I'll try to be brief so that you can go get your mother flowers and take her to lunch, which I guess is the tradition. Is that what you're all going to do? Okay, good. So what I want to be, I'm going to talk about global governance and its future, whether it has a future or, what I think are some clear trends. And the one thing that I think it's fair to say is that today's global governance is nothing like anything we've seen in the recent past. So there we go. This is just some of the ways. I don't know how many of you are writing on global governance or taking courses on global governance, but this is just a sample of the different ways in which, as scholars now, we write about global governance. We talk. I mean, it's insane. Multi-stakeholderism, which I didn't know was a term until last year. Post-Westphalian, pluralization, Copernican, polycentrism, regime complexes, orchestration, postmodern, spaghetti bowl, layered, nested, transnational, and then multi-level. This is an incredible number of concepts that we now use to talk about global governance. And I'll tell you, and the way it sort of occurred to me that this was happening was in a very practical way. I had taught global governance when I was at the University of Minnesota, and then I moved to George Washington University and was going to teach a global governance class. And it was about a 6-7 year gap between when I taught it at Minnesota and when I was going to teach it at George Washington. And I sat down with my syllabus that I used at Minnesota, which I thought was actually a reasonable syllabus, thinking I would not have to change it much. And then I sat down and I realized this syllabus doesn't work anymore, that the world has changed, and which is, I think the world doesn't change that quickly, but my sense was that that syllabus on global governance had been occupied largely by the study of international organizations. And I think it's fair to say that when most people talk global governance, what they're really teaching is international organizations. And so the course is designed to introduce you to the world of international organizations. And then oftentimes then there's, cases from different international organizations from different issue areas. And I found that no longer worked. And what I ended up doing in the syllabus was actually reducing international organizations to essentially 2 classes out of 30, and spent most of my time on all these other kind of weird actors and weird ways of governing that were taking place as we talk about sort of new forms of experimentation. And so that was a reality check for me, because I just thought that the way I had been teaching global governance wasn't really capturing what in fact seemed to be going on out there. So it was now a course on global governance. It was which I always thought it was. It was no longer a course on international organizations. Now, what has changed? This is a set of, that we know that things have changed, and I'll talk about more about how that is. But we actually don't have a good measure of change. So when we say something has changed in world affairs, the world isn't quite the same as it used to be. This is a different international order. What is it that we're looking at? How are we measuring change? And in fact, different scholars will look at a variety of different things in order to try to mark whether in fact the world has become different, transformed, or complicated. Some look at just simply the number of actors. And, that could be a matter of just noticing that at the time of, after post-World War II, we're talking about a few dozen states, and now we're talking about 192. It can be that we're talking about a change in the kinds of actors, where it was to teach a course on global governance on states and international organizations, and now you got to talk about NGOs and transnational actors and foundations and public-private partnerships. I mean, the world has just gotten much more complicated in terms of the actors. It may have changed in terms of what is governed. This is something that I'm always actually quite fascinated by, is what parts of the world do we think need to be governed? We didn't, 100 years ago, there was no such thing as the governance of refugees. Now we have the global governance of refugees. Migration is now a governance issue. There's a lot of things that we now think have to be regulated that we never knew were a problem. And increasingly, more and more of the world is governed in some way or another. And if it's not being actively governed, it's probably a conscious decision. So if the world of global finance isn't being actively governed, maybe that's because those who are involved in global finance don't really want to be governed. And so the world of what's being governed has changed. Complexity, whatever, when we talk about complexity, we talk about sort of multi-sided interactions in which those small interactions burst into bigger global changes. And even sort of how it is that all these different actors relate to one another, which is actually how I'm going to talk about it. And one of the things I'll say is that the way that I want to do is actually talk about how it is that how we think about to govern, what it means to govern and how to govern has fundamentally changed. And that's the way, as I said, I'm going to talk about it. So there's been a change in global governance, I want to argue, in terms of how are we doing it? Are we organizing? Are we governing through markets? Are we governing through networks? Or are we governing through hierarchies? And so the question here is, when we talk about global governance, are we still talking about international organizations? Not really. Are we talking about treaties? States don't do treaties anymore. The number of treaties that have been signed, ratified, has just simply dropped. We used to do treaties. We don't do treaties anymore. Are we talking about transnational and professional networks? Or do we govern through markets? This was actually one of the big questions about sort of carbon swaps and climate change, was to introduce market mechanisms in order to regulate emissions. So there are a variety of ways in which we can think about how it is that we're going to govern the world. And I want to sort of take us through that a bit. And just sort of one other example that I always find interesting that my students do are certification agencies. When Starbucks will tell you that they do fair trade. That seems to matter to somebody. So when when Stelbruck says we're using fair trade and they're saying, look, there's an NGO that actually has certified us, that's a form of global governance. And so what we want to do then is talk about the different ways in which governance is being organized. Now, I couldn't think of all this on my own. This is part of a project that I'm doing with two colleagues, one John Peavyhouse, who's at the University of Wisconsin, and the other one, Cal Rostiala, who is at UCLA. And we've been sort of organizing, we've been having these conversations for a while. We've organized 3 workshops, and we're in the process of putting together a book on this with a very nice team of collaborators. And so a lot of what I'm going to say is not something, it is something that is part of a collaboration. It's something I've done with John and Cal, but also with a bunch of other scholars who are also sort of quite interested in these questions about what changes are taking place in global governance. Now, I just want to say that we began, just to show you that we can change. When we began the study, and we began with a very American-centric way of thinking about this. And we began by saying that there's something that seems to have changed in global governance, and that is it seems to be playing small ball. Now, that's a baseball reference, but I know that there are ways in which you use, and so it used to be, right, in baseball, right, there's 2 ways to go. You swing for the fences, and you accumulate a lot of runs real quickly, and you pile them on, and then you just hold tight. And then small ball is where you actually, you get a walk, you steal, then there's a bunt, and then there's a sacrifice fly, and you're able to sort of eventually win, not with any big, home run hitters, but with a lot of people who can just sort of, make these little incremental changes. And that we thought was actually something that was taking place in global governance. And that the way we thought about it was when we talked about changes, we actually thought about, it used to be in the good old days, not that we ever lived in the good old days or that there ever were good old days, but that in the good old days, after World War II, global governance was swing for the fences. This was about creating the UN, big international treaties, the European Coal and Steel Community. This was about ambition. This was about gathering everybody together in a room and thinking about what you want to accomplish and then going for it. And we don't do that anymore. Rather, the ambitions are much more modest. They're incremental. They're experimental. That there's something about, and that was sort of our initial sort of observation, there's something different about how we're approaching it. And we didn't want to pass judgment about whether this was good or bad. There were some who'd say it's good, that incrementalism is good. There were some who say you can't solve climate change by having everybody replace their light bulb with something that's more environmentally friendly. And rather what you need is something that comes out of Copenhagen or Paris to really deal with climate change. This kind of incrementalism isn't going to get us anywhere. But the observation still stood, which was that we didn't seem to be ambitious anymore. And we wanted to capture that, and we wanted to know, is it because, in fact, of this less ambitious nature that what we're finding then is that the modes of global governance are changing? After all, if you're much less ambitious, why do you need big international organizations? You may actually be able to make these kind of small incremental changes through networks or markets. And so these are the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask. And in doing so, we had 3 basic questions. The first actually is, what is happening? And I say this because one of the striking aspects of the study of global governance is actually we don't know what we're talking about. We don't have data. So when we talk about how many NGOs or international organizations are there in the world, we actually don't have really good data. When we say that we have an instinct that it used to be ambitious, but it's not anymore, how would we measure it? How would you know? And so, part of what we wanted to do was actually go back and take a look and see, is our sense correct that the world really has changed? Because so much of what we write about in international relations is so much informed by our current experiences. And then we write history based on our current experiences. And so as a consequence, we introduce a whole bunch of bias and conventional wisdoms. And what we wanted to do was actually try to be a little more systematic about this, a little more historical. And then the second question is, why is this happening? If this is taking place, then why? And, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of hypotheses about this. And then the last is, does it even matter? We can actually tell you that the world is changing, but it's just rearranging, deck chairs on the Titanic. Is this just simply a matter of people feeling good because they're busy? Is it really accomplishing anything? Are all these conferences just another way of making us feel good? It's a way of self-medicating. Okay, it's basically a way of making yourself feel euphoric when in fact nothing's happening whatsoever. And so what we wanted to know is sort of what's at stake in all this. So that's kind of what I want to do in the remainder of the time. But let me just sort of go through, since I began by saying we don't have really good data. One of the things there's some data out there, but I just want to walk you through a little bit of the data that we compiled, because I think it does tell you that, in fact, some of my instincts, your instincts about the way the world is changing is actually, is largely correct. So, okay. So here's the first, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because they all essentially provide different perspectives to the same outcome. And the first one is here just simply the birth rates of international governmental organizations. What I'll just say is IOs. And what you can see is that there has been a steady rise. The first IO, depending on, the conventional wisdom, was somewhere in the 1850s, dealing with Rhine navigation. And there weren't really a lot. They've developed quite a bit over the years. A lot of the early ones were actually scientific and technological societies. And then what you began to see was then movement from science and technology and business into a broader set of issues that are about security and politics, and then questions of what I would just call global justice. And as you can see, the birth rates sort of skyrocketed, and it coincides largely with the end of war. So that, it's after World War I, it's after World War II. It's, there's still a fair bit of activity, a little bit with the end of the Cold War. But as you can see, it's just fallen off the edge. We don't establish international organizations anymore. They don't exist in the same way. Oh, now it's.
The second next slide.
That's the next slide. Okay, you can stay there. It's okay. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. Okay, okay. I don't know what that slide is. It was weird. Okay. So this one though is about, sort of tells you about sort of birth rate of states and birth rate of IOs. And as you can see, we've got more states, but we've got a whole lot more of IOs. And so as a percentage, when we think about sort of who's doing the governing, increasingly the governing is being delegated by states to international organizations. And so these are much more concrete bureaucratic forms. Here's again the change of creation rates that sort of tells you, again, the ups and downs, which tells you about number that are created per year. And again, what you see is everything is sort of moving in an upward trajectory. It's good to be an international organization. And then the end of the century hits, and no one's looking at you anymore. It's just you're no longer, the flavor of the day. This is actually probably the most I think one of the more interesting slides, but it's the one that is the most incomplete in terms of data, and it's the one I think probably has a lot of missing values, and it needs to be updated. But it's actually very time consuming to get this data. But here you have, this is networks, and the way we try to figure out networks in many ways is sort of how do groups present themselves? And so this is basically a tabulation of the number of organizations or institutional forms that present themselves as networks. And again, like a lot of what our theories tell us about the way the world has become more complicated and globalized, and how technology and communication have made it easier for us to communicate and to organize across borders. What we now see is that there's been an incredible escalation in the number of networks. That goes up more and more. It seems to have a little bit of a decline with the end of the century. For me, the big mystery is what's happened over the last 20 years. My sense is that it may have declined. We have evidence that the rates have slowed down, but still the number of networks that exist in the world continues to expand. And importantly, though, let's see if we got it. I'll go. Importantly, though, the number of networks continues to expand at a rate greater than the number of international organizations. So the consequence then is that if we're looking at global governance in terms of rates of change in the kinds of actors that exist out there, what we increasingly see is that there are more networks relative to international organizations and states. How much work they're really doing, I don't know. I think that varies by issue area to issue area, but we certainly know that the kinds of actors are changing in fundamental ways. This just sort of breaks it down into one issue area that has gotten a lot of attention. So I know that many of you are undergraduates. So if you're looking for a career, I would go into global health. This is actually one of the few areas that seems to be really expanding tremendously. So there's been a tremendous increase in global health organizations. These are the number of IOs and NGOs. You can see again, there has been an exponential increase. What you don't see is the amount of money that's pouring into these global health organizations. This is an incredible growth area. And we have now, in addition to the World Health Organizations, a lot of other new kinds of partnerships, public-private. We have foundations like the Gates Foundation that have essentially set the agenda for global health. We have a lot of NGOs that are involved in these things. And in fact, a lot of my students want to do global health. It seems to be an area of tremendous need, and also an area in which there is an expansion of a lot of jobs. But you have an increase in both global health IGOs and NGOs. They sort of, this is one of the things that, people are trying to figure out. They're kind of tracking one another, and it could be, and with NGOs being a little bit slower after lag effect after IOs. And so it looks like you create these IOs and then all these NGOs end up emerging around these large international organizations doing a variety of different kinds of tasks. Here again are the birth rates, which basically tell the same story. This is about linkages in which we're interested in the extent to which these international organizations begin to partner more and more with each other. Same with the NGOs, and you can see there's a lot more partnering between NGOs than there is between IOs and IOs with NGOs. And here's the most interesting slide, I think. This is actually, we didn't do this. This comes from a British think tank. And this is the kind of network map that everybody wants to have. And ideally what we would have is change over time. This is a snapshot. It tells us about global health governance from a few years ago. But what you can see is that there are, the big circles are IOs, and then the other ones are NGOs. And what you also find is that there are all these new kinds of linkages that are going on, and these linkages are actually being reinforced and being established by the creation of public-private partnerships, which is something that we hadn't really seen before. But now when you think about sort of the way it is that the Gavi Foundation on global health, or for the fighting of AIDS and things like that, these are all partnerships that are set up between corporations and foundations like the Gates Foundation and NGOs and international organizations. And they're growing over time. And in fact, they're swamping, and this has become one of the big debates, have these other new forms of public-private partnership become so big that World Health Organization and other big international health organizations can't do their job. And this is, so when you ask yourself, why was the World Health Organization so slow to deal with Ebola? Some people would say it's because a lot of the resources have been taken away from the World Health Organization and put into these other NGOs. And so they're just not able to work as fast as they were. So what these slides, I think, tell us then is that there's been a fundamental change that's been taking place in global governance. The slides from public health governance was just to sort of give you, an example in an issue area. But now what I want to do is actually get to sort of the meat of our argument. And again, the big question is, there are lots of ways we can think about change. There's no best way to think about change in global governance, but different ways of measuring change tells us different things. And so after actually, it took us a long time to get to this point. As I told you, we began by thinking we were going to do something about small ball and the lack of ambition. And at the end of the day, we decided that may be an important part of it, but it probably wasn't really what we were finding. And as we were working and as our collaborators were working, we were actually sort of stumbling upon this different way of thinking about the organization of global governance. And this is sort of what we came up with. Now, I should say this is as of 6 months ago. And so there's a lot of possibility for change. So I'm looking forward to, your thoughts and comments on this. But again, to repeat, when we think about sort of ways of governing the globe, there are three kind of architectures in an idealized sense. Not that we find any one in its purest form in the world, but rather when we think about ways in which governance exists, and this is not just true for global governance, but also for domestic governance, there are sort of three different kinds of modes. The one I want to begin first with hierarchies and then markets, because these are the ones that among organizational sociologists and others, these are the ones that tend to capture a lot of the attention. And then the third category called networks. Okay, so hierarchies. This was my syllabus in global governance when I was at Minnesota. This is about international organizations. And when you think about hierarchies as an organizational form, the model we tend to think of is the state. This is a situation where there basically is an authority and those who have to obey. So the state, vis-a-vis its citizens, or more fundamentally, the centralized state and those that are other units that are subordinated to the centralized state. And as a consequence, when we think about international organizations, what we think about then is, and this is why it's hierarchical, is we think about establishing large institutions. They've got buildings. You can take your picture in front of them. They've got a letterhead, okay? And what they are able to do then is they're given a task to do by states. And what they do then is they do that task by regulating in a very top-down way. You want us to regulate human rights? Okay, that's what we'll do. And we'll regulate human rights from the UN. And we'll then work our way down. And as a consequence, when we think about a lot of international organizations, when we think about hierarchical, we tend to think in this top-down form. Now, let me just say that the modes of how hierarchies work, or the forms, can be very different. So some people imagine maybe someday, if we're lucky, we'll get to a world state. And a world state would have this kind of, for some people, this kind of hierarchical form. It would be the Security Council kind of blown, a better Security Council, blown up and on a grander scale. Empires and hegemonies also governed the world, and they did so in a very hierarchical way. When we talk about the sort of old colonial forms, they were governing, and they were global, but they were hierarchical. Now we talk mainly about international organizations, and they have certain kinds of characteristics. They're bureaucracies. They're big bureaucracies. They operate through a chain of command where, someone above you says, here's what you do, and that's what you're supposed to do. So there is, command and obedience. Many of these organizations are based on the degree of expertise and specialization. They have standard operating procedures for how to deal with the world and the inputs and turning them into action. And so this is, when we think about global governance, this has often been the model. This is basically how our courses and the study of global governance has been organized. Now, what sociologists and others, and economists and others will tell you is that this is not the only way to govern. That, in fact, as an alternative to hierarchies, which are very top-down, heavy-handed, there are markets. And markets are another way of organizing. They're different because they're hidden hand. They don't have the same kind of heavy costs that are associated with these kind of hierarchical models. And there's a set of assumptions that go in with this kind of hidden hand or unregulated competition that works through competition. We have a set of actors who come together, who have a set of interests or pursuits. In order to get what they want, they need to interact with others. So there's a level of interdependence, but in the way they work with each other, it's through exchange. It's not by command. That's the way, markets work. These exchanges are voluntary. And we know whether to do an exchange because of price mechanisms. Again, it's a very different way of signaling how to act and how to be regulated than hierarchies. So whereas hierarchies operate through coercive and some non-coercive tools, here what we have in the beauty of markets are a hidden hand that allows these different actors to compete with one another, and that competition process can have a disciplining effect. It tells you how to behave. A seller that overcharges will go bankrupt. There's no reason to have a regulator to tell them that they're charging too high a price. There are other signals that are out there. The additional implication is that, unlike the traditional notions of governance, there's no single actor that can regulate everything. So one of the things we like about international organizations, maybe, is that that actor can control the world, maybe. Here, there is no single actor that isn't available to control. And so this is when we talk about different forms of working with climate change, as you probably know, markets are oftentimes used as a way to do it. So for instance, how are we going to get solar panels up on houses? Well, hopefully one way, you could regulate and say everybody must put solar panels up, or you could maybe subsidize the technology that goes into solar panels, bring down the cost, make it more cost effective, stop subsidizing oil, and therefore change the market price so that it becomes more cost effective to put more solar panels up. And therefore you go from a non-renewable to a renewable resource. But again, this is about sort of the way it is that economists and others think about sort of using markets in order to produce, in order to get us towards better outcomes on climate change. In global governance, we have, not only that, there are also a bunch of other sort of bizarre things that we don't tend to think about, but they're also governing, but through markets. So, for instance, there are credit and bonding agencies, which we became more aware of after 2008. There have to be credit agencies to give, certification in terms of the security or the risk associated with bonds. And we know what happens when municipalities don't get a good credit rating. They have to quickly move. Lending costs more money, and they have to change the way they do business. There are one of the interesting developments, this is the one I really love, is the various kinds of benchmarking and ranking that exist now, which is another way of governing. So I spent a lot of time, thinking about, for instance, I don't know how Mexican academia works, but I can tell you that in the United States, my students are obsessed with rankings of their institution, and administrators are incredibly obsessed with rankings of their institutions. And, you don't know how these rankings develop. We have U.S. News and World Report, but there are competitors now. And depending on what these private agencies do, these are for-profit, and how they rank can have a big impact on where students decide to apply. That's a regulatory mechanism. It's not direct, it's indirect. And if you want to know how, I don't know whether you looked at any rankings when deciding whether to come to this school or not, but, professors look at the rankings when they think about where do they want to go teach, and administrators are obsessed with the rankings. And they figured out all kinds of ways to game the system. But again, what that is about using sort of competitive dynamics in order to push and regulate organizations. And then I already mentioned certification agencies that will certify whether the soccer, the footballs that you use have been, done with through sort of certified labor or not. And so there are a lot of ways then in which we see that, through our consumer action and our individual choices, we actually play a role in global governance. Now, though, up until about 20, 30 years ago, when people talked about governance, and especially domestic and especially in the realm of economics, they usually talked about it only in terms of hierarchies versus markets. But now we've gone to an explosion of interest in networks. Now, I have to say that networks don't have any kind of precise definition, or I should say there's no accepted consensus definition about what a network is. There are a variety of different ones, but the presumption, though, is that we may not know what they are, but we know what they're not. And they're not markets or hierarchies. And so they occupy this kind of ambiguous space in which they have a variety of maybe very quite different characteristics. But, for many people, this is where global governance has gone. And what it's trying to do is basically suggest that the way governance works is not like markets or hierarchies, but rather this is a situation where different actors that have shared interests come together for a common purpose. They come together in a way in which there's equality. So, hierarchies don't presume equality. Markets don't necessarily, presume equality except in a legal sense. But there's a presumption, though, is that you come together in a spirit of equality. Disputes and differences that occur in the network are supposed to be resolved through negotiation and persuasion. That's why networks, you have lots and lots of meetings. And so for any of you who've been involved in a network, you know how time consuming that is. But because of the constant meetings and interactions, hopefully they generate trust. This is a form of governance that actually depends more on trust than either markets or hierarchies. And the presumption is for many people, and this is the kind of argument that is associated with Anne Marie Slaughter, who wrote, what was the first statement? It was on network power. I forget the name of the book, but basically she's been a big proponent that not only is the world moving towards networks, but it should be networked. So it's not just a statement about the way the world is, it's about the way the world should be. And her argument is that networks are a more nimble, flexible, cost-effective way of learning and accomplishing public goods. That networks are just simply superior, they're better. And I don't, there's a big debate about whether that's true or not, but I think the argument that, in fact, more of the world is networked in one way or another has become, I think, has been accepted as the conventional wisdom. So we have then three modes of global governance. And again, just to sort of, put a fine point on it, the conventional wisdom has been, in our studies of global governance, have always assumed that this is about hierarchy. When in fact, what we're finding as we look more carefully is that markets and networks are not just secondary and tertiary, but are actually becoming increasingly important. Now, the question is, why is this happening? And I'll just say, we don't know. Okay? So I'm not going to, pretend to tell you. All I can tell you is that we've got a really neat list of possibilities. Okay? But like everything that we talk about with grand historical change, it's never one thing. The world's not going to hell because of Donald Trump. Okay? It's not, if it's going to hell, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why it's going to hell. Okay? So when we think about grand historical change, we need to think of the variety of different factors. And here's our top 55. There are several PowerPoint slides that go after this. Just kidding. This is an interesting, survey because when we talk about the changes that are taking place, you kind of want to know why. And in fact, there is no single answer, but all of them may have, and I would just say this, some may be more important for some issue areas than others. So if we're trying to think about sort of changes in global governance with respect to non-proliferation, well, I think you should start with geopolitics. And this is a big question, right, in terms of, for realists especially, where they think everything comes down to geopolitics and state interests. If you're looking for a master variable and you're a realist, you would say geopolitics is what's changing all this. Others, though, from a political economy perspective, would talk about changes in capitalism that have taken place, not simply in terms of sort of the kind of capital, but where capital is located. Another actually very astute observation, this is something written by Thomas Hale and David Held and some others, is about the emergence of global gridlock. So essentially we talk about gridlock in politics. It's not just domestic politics, it's international politics. And gridlock means you can't get anything done. And so if you're trying to get something done and you have to keep dealing with these yahoos, these people you don't like from other states, then what do? You go around them. So in this context then, sort of run through some of these possibilities then, international organizations are increasingly difficult places to get things done, if they ever were. And so if you're finding life is difficult at the UN, go do something else. And do it in a much more, let's say, stealth way through markets or through minilateralism or through networks, multi-stakeholderism. Trying to get agreement among 192 states is impossible. It could be that we've seen a decline in ideological homogeneity when we talk about that so-called Western liberal order. These were about states that were ideologically aligned. the world isn't so ideologically aligned anymore. Low-hanging fruit argument says that essentially what we've done, and this is the kind of argument you see in trade governance, is that you've negotiated all the real easy things to negotiate. You've negotiated, basic commodities. But to get into agricultural products or services is much more difficult, which is why the round that has never been finished has gone on for 20 years. And so you've done the easy things, and now you're stuck with the more difficult things. There can be ideologies of governance. One of the things you can think about here, which I think is actually really important. Oh, it's now jumping. Oh, okay. Is that it might be that, as you think about it, these are not just different modes of governance, but oftentimes, as I suggested with Anne-Marie Slaughter's work, people are passionate about a particular form of governance. Some people think that the best way to run the world is through markets. It's kind of a laissez-faire ideology. Other people think that networks are the way to go. So this is not just simply a matter of empirics. There are shifts that take place in global governance. And one of the important shifts that took place in global governance several years ago was the shift from sort of a Keynesian top-down to a much more neoliberal tradition, which emphasized more markets. And that didn't happen because that was a political decision in many respects. Pluralization of pluralization, and that just means that in part because of technology, what you now have are more different kinds of actors than ever before that are playing a role. And so that suggests that, as I'll get to technological change is a big master variable here that should not be overlooked. One of the interesting things that's come up in our project that we had not actually anticipated, I will tell you that I threw this one in at the very early stages, rationalization. What that basically means is sort of the way it is that we calculate, the way it is that we do business, the way knowledge is privileged in some settings or in others. But in our finding is that increasingly, a lot of the world is networked through experts, through expert communities. And these are playing a much more important role, oftentimes outside of international organizations, but oftentimes working through international organizations. So these network associations are incredibly important. Growing complexity, I'll just be brief here. There's a term that's associated with my co-author, Cal Rastiola, in terms of regime complexity, where different issue areas same issue areas are increasingly governed by different regimes. I mentioned technological change. Some people talk about regime change in terms of domestic politics, democratic to authoritarian. But the one that actually was not on our list, really, it was sort of got mentioned that now has been, this is not a rank order, I should say. I haven't said this one's, but I think if I were to rank order these, the domestic forces, just populism and nationalism. One of the things that makes global governance possible, right, is that it has a degree of public support. Not clear anymore. How am I doing okay. So, what I've suggested here is that, these kinds of drivers produce, if you will, different kinds of opportunities and constraints for different ways of thinking about the organization of global governance. So if you're a human rights activist and you know that states, their job is to basically violate human rights, and you want to stop that, well, you can work through states because ultimately you have to work through states. But you also find that if you really want to get things done, you need to organize through networks. And then hopefully if you create dense networks, you'll begin to actually able to push your influence. So one of the ways, that I want to just sort of caution is that as we think about, two things. As we think about these drivers, imagine the extent to which they give different kinds of incentives for different kinds of ways of regulating the world. Okay? And then the other here is that we shouldn't think of these as necessarily, and this is one of the things that we're still working through, as either or. It's not as if these are in zero-sum competition. That if you have more hierarchy, by definition, you have, the other two go down, or vice versa. But instead, what we're seeing increasingly in a lot of issue areas is the extent to which these are the importance, the significance, and the relationship between these modes is changing. So the nature of global governance and climate change has shifted in these directions in interesting ways. And so we need to think, I think, in a much more complicated way. Let me, because I've got just a little bit of time, let me just skip that next slide. I don't think we need it. If you want me to come back to it, I'm happy. But okay. This is actually where was that important? Yeah, it is. But I spent, months on that. But, at this point, I'm going to have to let it go. I want to talk about why this matters. Because at the end of the day, at least I care about these things because they have effects. I'm not interested simply in marking change. I actually want to know, does it matter? Is it consequential? What does it mean to say that the world of global governance is changing? And there are 4 different kinds of effects I just want to note in a conclusion. The first is this question of effectiveness. I've already mentioned it. I've already said that we have a really difficult time measuring whether one form of governance is more effective than another. There's a big debate about whether small is beautiful. I mean, there are a lot of people who do networks or markets like the idea of not having big bureaucracy. And there are others who would say, and so this is good enough governance. Others would say this is not good enough governance, and really miss the day where you build big international organizations with treaties. And in truth, we really don't know what is more likely to work or work better or work in different ways. But that's kind of the big challenge that we have in front of us. I actually don't know if all these sort of more interesting and elaborate public-private partnerships, for instance, are really making the world a better place. It's a matter of debate, but that's where we're going. But I think it's an important debate to be had. Because if we're putting all our energy in these directions, don't you want to know that it actually is accomplishing our desire to make the world a better place? I do. The other interesting element is, what I would call crowding out. And this is, this actually pivots into another set of literatures called historical institutionalism, which is very much interested in how it is that you have institutional change, why it is that some institutions get locked in. And so even though they may no longer be effective or functional, they still are there. And maybe what they're there is because they've got sunk costs, they've got a lot of people, partisans who are supporting them, but they may not be doing their job as well. There was an interesting set of arguments. Someone was speculating that, to what extent had the creation of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, basically suffocated the global justice environment so that it becomes the epicenter of anything we think about in terms of global justice, and therefore makes experimentation more difficult. Or it means, consequently, that our notions of global justice will rise and fall based on the way the ICC, survives. So one of the things that we want to know is sort of, how do we think about these things over time? Third, and this is, and we're moving closer to my heart, the third is about power. And here, when I think about it, I think about power in terms of patterns of inclusion and exclusion. So one of the things that people seem to like about markets and networks is that they seem to be more inclusive. They seem to be more democratic. That's the selling point oftentimes, as opposed to hierarchies, which are much more top-down and command-driven. The presumption then is that this new era of global governance, part of the way we teach global governance, is that global governance itself tells us that we live in a much more pluralized world where there are more actors involved. And so it's more inclusive. And if you go back and read that global governance literature back in the early 1990s, this was what it was all about. It was going to be inclusive. This was the Global Governance Commission. I don't know. One of the things that we're increasingly seeing, one of the big changes that I made is sort of more inclusive of partnerships and multi-stakeholderism. These are big buzzwords in a lot of issue areas. What we're finding is that, yes, there are more actors with a seat at the table. So it's no longer an all-Western club, all-rich person's club. Then increasingly what you have are people from the global south and NGOs and marginalized population. But the real question is they're at the table, but they can be seen but not heard from. So this is just simply a legitimating device. So despite all this sort of hand-waving gesture in favor of inclusion, nothing's really changed. It's window dressing. It just looks better. And it makes the rich and the powerful feel better. Because they can say, oh no, we were inclusive. And then finally, there is this issue of legitimacy. And one of the arguments for why it is that we've moved from hierarchies to networks, for instance, is that these are more legitimate forms because they're more inclusive, because they provide for more opportunities for participation. And so there is an assumption here that some of these forms are more legitimate than others. And as a consequence, some are more likely to be effective than others. And again, I think this is a really good question. I think we've clearly moved away from the idea that NGOs are necessarily more legitimate than any other organization simply because they're non-governmental. It's not clear anymore. And so I think what we're moving into in this more complex environment then is a much more complicated way of trying to think through this question of legitimacy and who these organizations represent. Let me stop there. I appreciate your patience. And you should tell all this to your mother at lunch. She'll be, so happy.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So we'll go into Q&A. We have about 30 minutes, and I suggest we do rounds of 3. So if you could raise your hands, and then we'll circulate the microphone.
Thank you.
You can introduce yourselves and sort of just so I know.
Yes, Marcela Lopez Vallejo here from CIDE. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, but I was kind of confused. I started with the idea that the 3 modes of governance you presented were exclusive. They didn't, either there was one either or the other.
Right.
But at the end, you mentioned that their interaction has changed the perception of global governance and their effectiveness and legitimacy and whatever. So the question is, are these 3 forms actually interacting? In what ways? Who's dominating which? Because at your last comment, I thought hierarchies were dominating on the others, or I was confused.
Yeah, no, and it's something, that we're still working through. I think so we begin first with the idea, right, that there are 3 different modes, and we treat them as ideal types. So we're saying, look, there are these 3 ways to think about governance, and we're not assuming that that if you take a little slice of any part of global governance, that you can identify easily whether it's hierarchical or market or networked. What we're saying though is that that what you're probably likely to see is maybe that one is more dominant than the other. Okay, so that one may be more likely, and this is what we're finding in post-World War II, it was more weighted towards a hierarchical, and what you see now is a shift, but also a layering in which there's a new set of interactions that are taking place in new ways. And what those are, we don't know. All we can at this point, I'm only comfortable saying is that it obviously promotes a much more complex architecture in which they're interacting in different ways. The other thing I will say is that that I've become more convinced by over time is that hierarchy never disappears. There's always a shadow of hierarchy. Okay, so even in the classic economic model of markets, there is no place in the world that is just markets as economic textbooks would suggest. Because markets only exist if there are property rights. Property rights are only secured by political authority. And which means that there has to be some kind of hierarchy standing behind markets. That's something we have known for a long time, and institutional economics has taught us. And so I don't want to, I don't want to create a kind of caricaturish world, because at least the world, I spend a lot of time on humanitarian governance. And one of the things that has really impressed me is the extent to which there is a simultaneous, there are hierarchies within the NGO community, which, so not all networks, right, are flatlined the way they suggest. There are some that are at the top and some that are at the bottom. And so the world that I study of humanitarian governance, it's the Western NGOs that stand at the top, and the global Southern NGOs cannot get a seat at the table. Well, they like to, those in the West call them networks. I think of them as hierarchies. And so, one of the things that we need to do is I think more in a sophisticated way how these things shift over time. And I think one of the things that's happening in the chapters that are being produced for the volume is that the authors themselves are trying to incorporate those shifts and think about these, when you look at climate governance, to look at the way in which they go, you said you wanted to collect 3, and look at what I just did. I don't listen. No, I feel shamed.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the talk, very stimulating. And my question is somewhat linked to this. So I was reminded a little bit as you began giving the talk of what one used to hear about globalization and the end of the state and the post-Westphalian and post-sovereignty. And I was wondering what's your take on that now? Because you were telling us about sort of the decay, in a sense, of IOs. You were telling us about sort of the emergence or the predominance or increase of markets and networks. So does that mean that the state is decaying, that public power is no longer what it used to be, that we don't have the same expectations? So basically, the question is, what implications does your narrative have for sort of the future of the state as a form of political organization? And perhaps linked with that, and sort of an extra question is, so who's doing the governing in global governance, right? So you have states and IOs, you have some form of identifying the authority, you have mechanisms of accountability to some extent, you have, so I guess the question of legitimacy, if there is a decay of the state form, what do we have to replace something like accountability and the old ways of legitimacy that we're familiar with?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I work on European politics, and network analysis is a very old issue in EU analysis. Anne-Marie Slaughter started doing European politics.
Yeah.
So my question is, have you thought about different types of networks? Because clearly, depending on you stressed a few times that it varies a lot from issue area.
Right.
I worked on agriculture in Europe, and it's certainly a policy network, but it rarely moves. And it's full of vested interests, hierarchy, it's very closed, and it prevents change. Whereas if you look at, technology, it's Google and Facebook and how they interact, and really whether the EU Commission puts a fine or not doesn't matter. What really changes the governance in this network is actually technological change. Mm-hmm. So is your team working on new typology of networks is one question. And the other one has to do with his question about the state and how this has implications for a new definition of the state, which is much more disaggregated.
Mhm.
And instead of looking at this single rational actor as the realists would think, you're actually looking more at organizations. One ministry works with its particular network of NGOs and interest groups and publics.
Okay, I'm Luis, by the way. And my question goes like, I think it's very difficult for an individual to escape from hierarchies, and it would be really, well, almost impossible to isolate myself from the markets, for example. But in networks, I think it has a lot to do with personal decisions and questions like who am I and what I want to work on and who I want to work with. And I mean, if I am an environmental or ecological guy, you would say it's very likely to me to join Greenpeace or something like that. No, and in that way, I think it's networks are kind of an identity. And I was wondering if you consider that there is a supreme network ideology or a high issue that NGOs are working on, and that will eventually set the international agenda, like some other ideologies have done in the past, like, for example, religion or other kind of identities. That's it.
Those are great questions. Let me try, and because I got so many great questions, I can handpick and avoid the ones that are really too tough. Let me try and go in order. I think it's part of the reasons why I'm interested in global governance is because it also helps us think about global order. And I think that's sort of that's lurking behind your question about whether, in fact, the way we think about world order has changed. And that was certainly part of the debate about the end of sovereignty, the decline of the state, and so forth, was whether we're moving into, when you say we're moving from a Westphalian to a post-Westphalian global governance, what we're really saying is we're moving away from a state governance to a post-state. I've never, I think there's no doubt for me that, we've had these arguments on the disaggregated state for a long time, and that many of the first literature on complex interdependence was really about the relationship, back in the 1970s, between the finance ministries in Britain and the Treasury Department in the United States, and how it is that the mid-level bureaucrats would get together and form. And this was oftentimes when Anne-Marie Slaughter first wrote about networks, she was really talking about these transgovernmental linkages. She wasn't really talking about networks as commonly understood now, but she was talking about, for instance, the growing interaction between judges and lawyers, and Supreme Court justices, and the way that was actually providing a mechanism for learning and socialization. So I think, I think that's always been part of the conversation. And like anything that I think is novel, we tended to make more of it at times than we probably should have. But I think it did demonstrate that there were, I think, important changes that were taking place. But what it also suggests then is that, and this is sort of something that, again, I'm just, sort of wrestling with a bit, is the presumption that certain kinds of world orders or certain kinds of technological changes necessitate certain kinds of shifts in global governance. There is, that's kind of the argument of the networks, is that because the world is organized in different ways, because there's new technology, because there's new possibility of a speed of communication and the ability to meet with one another face to face and virtually, that these changes then necessitate that there'll be changes in global governance. And this is a functional change. And I'm always wary of, in historical arguments, functionalist arguments, because I've seen the world go in really dysfunctional ways. And so not all kinds of big structural changes necessarily lead to the kind of structural change, that the kind of outcomes. So, for instance, there were the set of arguments really after the end of World War II that was first made by John Hertz that talked about how nuclear weapons were going to transform the nature of world politics. That this was such a different kind of weapon system that it would necessitate a world state. That because you can now blow up the world and end civilization, you now needed a new kind of world governance. This is the kind of argument that another, that I think very well done, Dan Dewdney, also made about sort of these underlying changes in society and security that will necessitate changes in how we organize ourselves. And this is kind of classic Marxist as well, that changes in structure will lead to changes in superstructure. I guess my instinct though is to say yes. I think that's possible. It changes some of the incentive systems, but again, this is the part of me that says, the extent to which there is change that we see as functional for governance is, I think, always an empirical question. I've seen a lot of dysfunction in a lot of ways world orders operate. So I'm not sure. And there are those, and we go back to some of the, some people think networks themselves are a mark of progress, that they're just superior for a whole bunch of reasons. And so, and that's been brought about because of underlying technological and ideological change. Again, I think these are interesting arguments, but I'm not convinced. And part of it is that one of the things that I want to keep in mind here, maybe I should just go back for a second, is that, this is where I don't want to get stuck in terms of linearity, in terms of the way I think about these. And I do worry I get stuck because, I put up hierarchies and then markets and networks. And there's a kind of, there's a story that I'm kind of, embedded in this. It's not just there are three different modes of governance, but there's kind of an implicit story you could read into it, which we're moving from hierarchies to markets to networks. This is the transition. And we also have seen lots of evidence in which networks go back into hierarchies. So, for instance, John Ruggie, who very famous IR scholar, who was very instrumental in helping to promote the first set of innovations on the relationship between business and human rights, and done through the UN. If I get something wrong here, you let me know. Okay. And one of the things he there was an assumption was that in many ways the story was about gridlock. That if you really want to get something done, you can't really work with the UN. And there were a lot of NGOs that were really angry with him because they wanted a treaty, and he said, no treaty is ever going to happen in your lifetime in terms of human rights regulating business activities. And so we're going to do something in the end around. We're going to go through an informal way. But as he told me later, there was an assumption that this was going to be the end. It wasn't going to be just kind of this informal network that was organized through interesting kinds of governance innovation, so that hopefully at the end of the day, you could work yourself back into a hierarchy. That what had been informal could become formalized. Maybe someday there would be enforcement mechanisms to get corporations to stop human rights violations. But it's a matter then of saying, okay, so how do these things move backwards and forward? Can we imagine it? And so I don't want to suggest, and sort of what I'm seeing oftentimes is this movement that could go back and forth. I don't know what drives it. I just know that I don't want to get, rigid in my thinking about the relationship between these things. Yes, there are different types of networks. I think the interesting thing, though, is in many ways when people talk about networks, they really think about inclusivity, that there's no barriers to entry. And in fact, one of the things that I see in networks, all networks that I've seen, is that there are tremendous barriers to entry. This is about politics. Okay, there are closed shops and open shops. Most shops are closed. Okay, they're closed. They're very unequal between insiders and outsiders. And so, and again, but this is one of these ways where, yes, there are different types of networks and they operate in different ways, and people have very fluid ideas about what this means. But I just, so we're going to lay out one and then bury ourselves from it. But that's just for the, you have to make, you have to state your case and then debate from there. And I agree with you. I think technological change has been very important. I would say in my field, I'm happy to talk about it later. In my field of humanitarian governance, I think technological change is going to be the real sort of game changer, as they say. I think that's going to be the great disruptor, and it's already happening. So change is not going to come from within; it's going to come from without. I like your question, Louis. I agree. I can't escape hierarchies either. But we can all imagine different ways in which we can create a little more autonomy for ourselves. And I think one of the things again, reflecting on my experience by those who work in the aid community, is that there is a very strong ideological bent to those who actually join these movements or activities. And part of it is it's a political statement. This is what I see from people who work in the aid community. It is a clear political statement that I'm not going to live in a world that allows people to be treated as waste. Okay? That the world treats, our international order is organized in a way that it sacrifices millions of people. I'm not going to live in that world. So it's a political statement. And part of that political statement then is, in addition, is that I'm not going to work with the state because the state is complicit in that world. What I'm going to do is join alternative movements, whether they're grassroots movements or civil society organizations or other kinds of networks that I believe more clearly articulate my worldview, the hope I want for the world, and I'm able to do so. What the network does is actually provide a platform for me to work with others who are like-minded. And so as a consequence, not only do I feel less lonely, but there's power in numbers. And yes, I want to build it up. And it doesn't mean, and ultimately you can't avoid the state because it's got the coercive apparatus. So you still have to work with the state, but at the same time though, the motivations that we know this from studies, the motivations for people who actually join a lot of these grassroots organizations is not simply that I think there's a better means to an end, but it's also because of a clear political, it's a political move. And I would also say the people who I've worked with in the human rights and humanitarian community, and it speaks directly to your question of religion, is that I do think that even the most secular minded are very religious in the sense that they see themselves as expressions and creators of humanity. I think for them, humanity has the same significance as God in the sense that it's a transcendental argument. You can't, this is probably controversial. You can't prove or disprove the existence of God. You can't prove or disprove the existence of humanity. It's just a metaphysical commitment. And so the people I know who work in the rights and the aid community insist that they're operating in the name of humanity. And that's just a matter of belief. But they see themselves as doing something that's bigger than them, which I think is the reason why you see so many of these networks. They want to feel as if they're doing something. My students want to join these things. They don't want to join necessarily Wall Street. Sure.
Hello, my name is Angelica Huerta. I study political science, and I think that all changes come with a framework. Before the 50s, the role of the states was strong. They used to regulate, intervene, create jobs, and around 50s to 70s, it started changing. The market was a predominant. States started to stop regulating. It was like this invisible hand regulating the market. put everything. Okay. So my question is, I think that we have still a very strong framing that, like the liberal framing. So if we still think that the perfect world is like inclusive and everything like that, how do you think that the next global governance or the next order will be if we are still having this framing of the liberal framing?
Hello, my name is Mariano Cepeda. I'm an economics student. And well, basically, I understand that right now we're seeing this change between going from hierarchies to a more dynamic system. But well, according to what I understood from your presentation, there was this period where hierarchies clearly had like this, like they were the central part of the global governance system. So my question is, are we headed towards a period where we will not see a dominance of any of these three modes? Or will, just like in the post-war era, one of these modes like be the predominant system for a couple of decades maybe?
I have a question related to networks. I mean, it's very clear that they're important. How are they achieving, or how are they regulating the world? I mean, they're not using the coercive power of the state. How are they doing it?
I can be really brief on this one. Okay. Was there one more? Then I'll use it.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo Garcia, and I want to ask you, where do international regime complexes fit into these three modes of global governance? Is it a network, or is it more like a conjunction of all these different modes, or is it like a network, but inside of each part or actor of it are based on different modes or models?
Okay. You're gonna hit me when it's over. Yeah. No. Okay. So I'll be brief, and I'm happy to continue talking after if I'm too brief. I think for me what your question raises is there a way for us to think about global governance that it does not have the overlayer of liberalism? What would that look like? Now, it may be that what it tells us is that this frame of liberalism is so powerful that we can't think of outside that framework. It also may be that we'll have to find other language to talk about some of these basic principles and values that, we've been told over the years are not exclusively liberal, but they've become packaged that way. And so I don't know. I confess that I'm a lot older than you, so I've been more clearly socialized and brainwashed. So there's really little hope for me. But I don't have a way of thinking outside, this notion of liberalism. But I think what matters to me, and this is partly why I get aligned with, I think, is that there are certain kinds of values that I would unapologetically defend. Some of those values happen to line up with liberalism. Some of them don't. But unfortunately, I think liberalism becomes the way in which we're asked to, understand everything, including whether this is a liberal world order or not. And everybody gets panicked that somehow the best thing that we've ever had in our lives is about to disappear. On the network and the regulation, there's the question of how do networks contribute to broader global governance? And part of that is, as we've learned from a lot of very good work on transnationalism, part of it is different kinds of mobilization, different kinds of discursive moves, and linkages and framing and things like that. in terms of the other part that's interesting is as we talked about in terms of inclusivity, exclusivity, is how they regulate within themselves. And so there's a lot more attention to professional associations and how they actually regulate their members as well. And on the regime complex, I guess was there one other missing? Oh, anyway, on the regime complex, it's an interesting question. I wish my co-author was here, since he's worked in this so often or his research, is that I don't, when I think of regime complex, I think of it as the extent to which two different regimes are converging on a particular issue area. And then the question is, which regime is going to win, or how are they going to relate to one another? So, for instance, on refugee, it used to be that there was just simply one complex for refugee governance by the UNHCR and refugee law. And now increasingly there's human rights law. And human rights is just taking over the world. So when I think about, let's say, humanitarianism, it was IHL. And now we have all these human rights people too. And so now you have a competition between IHL, International Humanitarian Law, and International Human Rights Law to govern the same activities like armed conflict. And so, in each of these, you will have different kinds of modes of governance. But I think the real issue here is how these two different regimes sort of work out their differences, because there are fundamental differences.
With that, we should give Professor Barnett a round of applause. Thank you for being here.